Oh yeah, now we're all like tee, 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 tee. Now we're all like I'm trying to capture what it was that made me feel so hopeful after watching Ken Burns. That there was, because I've been feeling very hopeless about dialogue. And you know, I after watching him, I was like, okay, it might be possible. Now, what was that in his speech that made me think that?
I think his manner and the way he says it is just, yeah, it was outstanding.
No, but he also took it down the basics in some ways.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know, I mean, he gave like a little measuring stick, right? I can't remember what it was. I should have watched it again. Hi, Linda.
Ah, sorry, I was muted. Hello.
Hi to you. Hello, everybody. We're just starting to let people in. We're definitely hoping that you will become present with your video so that we can have a real conversation. And as we're letting people in, we're encouraging people to put their name and email address and affiliation in the chat, which we share with everybody who was here, so that it's a way of setting yourself up for networking. And here's Kay. Hi, Kay.
Howdy. Let's see. All right.
Here comes History Cambridge.
Um,
Hi, Marika. Hi, Heather.
My dog is snoring so loudly because on my last Zoom meeting, she was busy eating my sandals, which I didn't notice until she'd already finished one. So now she's full and happy and snoring like a drunk hippopotamus. So apologies. I'll be muted as much as I can.
Well, we can't hear her. I can't hear her.
You
So
can't? Okay, good. 'Cause I can.
I told T to come home and pick up the dog just in case he went into a barking spat. I've never had a barky dog before. It's a new experience. Hi, Marika.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good. Nice to see everybody. Um, I might go off camera. I'm sitting in my bed. I'm recovering from foot surgery. Not very interesting, but it happened, and I feel a bit informal. So,
We actually can't see that you're informal, so
okay, it just looks like I'm in an old setting, which just happens to be my
that's
house because I
right.
like old things. But happy to be here. Look forward to hearing the conversation.
Yeah, good. I hope you'll participate some despite the foot surgery. I hope you'll be okay. So, I'm gonna give it a few more minutes. Friday afternoon, almost summer. We had 40 people signed up. and they're slowly coming in. For those of you who have just come in, we encourage everybody to put their contact information and their affiliation in the chat. We shared a chat with everybody who was here at the end after the meeting, and this is a way to set yourself up for networking. And we also encourage people to be on camera and participate in the conversation. Wow, we've got someone from England. Hi, Billy. So Jane, when the clock strikes 12:04, do you want to start?
I will. How will
Great.
I know when it strikes 12:04? I can look at my thing.
It just struck 12:04.
Oh, okay. And so I'm on. And hello and welcome to Conversations on the Commons, a project of the Mass History Alliance. Conversations on the Commons are just that, informal conversations, and you are invited to participate in the discussion, ask questions, and use the chat. This event is streamed live on YouTube, and those of you watching there are invited to comment and send questions, which we will monitor to the best of our ability. And I should note this is the last conversation on the Common for this season. We'll be back in the fall with an exciting lineup of conversations, including sources for Latino history in Massachusetts, merchandising 101, good information on the internet, making a living in history, very sensitive subject, and more. Before we start, here's some housekeeping. Once we start the conversation, please keep your microphone muted until you are called on. Lowers the background noise. This is meant to be an informal conversation. We invite you to turn on your video. In fact, we like that. Use the chat. We send it around after. Start by introducing yourself. Put your name, email address, and town or organizations if you want to share those. Also comment, ask questions, share resources, or raise any tech issues during the conversation. Let us know if you have something to say by raising your hand. So see the participants list and you can raise your hand. If you are on the phone, just ask to break in. Make sure that your name is correct in the participants list, like mine never is. You can do this by hovering over your name in the list, then clicking more. If you're on the phone, just click participants and then click your name. If we get Zoom bombed, which we haven't had to experience, we will immediately close the conversation and send you a link for a new one to start immediately. So look at your email if that happens. After today's conversation, please leave us with a survey response. The link is in the chat. For those of you following the live stream on the Commons site, there's a link to the survey in the Conversations archive. I'd like to thank MHA's top sponsors, Mass Humanities, the State Historical Records Advisory Board, and Mike Petoskey. If you find all our sponsors on the Commons website, you can find all the sponsors on the Commons website. The link will be in the chat. And also, we also would like to invite you to add your organization to the Commons list directory and sponsor the Commons. Everything costs money. And so if you can spare $25, whatever you can, we'll gladly have it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today, historian and contractor Plume Borisius is a board member of the Mass History Alliance. She is the principal of Swift River press, public history, and communications, working with historical organizations on their planning and projects, as well as the management of their historic buildings. Previously, I could go on, she was the Assistant Director of Mass Humanities and lecturer in history and literature at Harvard University. Her alter ego is writer and photographer Agatha O. And take it away, Plume.
Thank you, Jane. Wonderful. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Mass History Alliance and Conversations on the Commons. Today, we're going to be talking about the public historian in an election year. During an election year, the media like to spout numbers and facts and historical numbers and facts. People quote their versions of what is the true history of their country, state, or city, sparring on who did what to whom and when. Gotcha. What does history look like in the public consciousness? Is there a more productive way to engage history in the political process? How is public history of use to us? People in public history in an election year? How can we be of use to the community? How might historical organizations model productive uses of history? How might historical organizations engage people from across the political spectrum or encourage civic reflection rooted in history? Join us for a conversation tackling these and similar issues with Margot Shea, Professor of Public History at Salem State University, and Dr. Noelle Trent, President and CAO of the Museum of African American History, Boston and Nantucket. Bring your lunch and your questions, observations, successes, and failures. That's today. Before we start, I'm going to quickly launch the poll so that we will know who is in the room. It only has one question. So I think it won't take too long. We try to keep track of, it's one of those best practices of who our audience and our participant are and who are the people who are not here also, and try to convince them otherwise. So we're almost there. 3 more to go. Okay, is anybody still working on the poll? I'm going to end it now. And I'm going to share the results briefly. And we have, as we are wont to have, 2/3 of us are from a local historical society, museum, or historic house. Another 20% from a local historical commission, and a few of us from a public library or a historic park. So we are, in fact, who we hope to be. So that's kind of good in some ways. So I've just lost my, the clicking, it loses you your script. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and I'm going to ask both panelists a particular question, and each of them will give us about 5 minutes of their thoughts on that question, and then we're going to have a conversation with we hope, with all of us. So here it is. Today we talk about the public historian, and a public historian par excellence is Dr. Noelle N. Trent, the president and CEO of the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket. An accomplished public historian, she has served on committees for the American Alliance of Museums, American Association of State and Local History, Association of African American Museums, and the International Sites of Conscience. She has collaborated with institutions like the National Park Service and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Formerly, she was Director of Interpretation, Collections, and Education at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, overseeing major exhibitions and initiatives, including the MLK 50 commemoration. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Today Show. Dr. Trent graduated Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude from Howard University, and holds a doctorate in United States history. We are so privileged to have Noelle Trent here. Welcome, Noelle. What do you see as the role of the public historian in an election year?
Well, I think the role of a public historian in an election year is pretty much consistent with our role is any other year, right? Part of it is to present this history, and a lot of what we do is translating the academic history for a wider audience, right? It is the preservation, the interpretation, the conservation of these works that do this storytelling. But there's a greater awareness that happens in an election year, and I think it's very important for those sites with political ties, either to voting rights, legal cases, even places where ideas were discussed, debated, and resulted in some sort of conflict, either verbal or physical, to highlight that, to make people aware of what's going on. In my previous work as a site where civil rights movement work happened, and a lot of the civil rights sites do this. This is the time that we make people aware of the sacrifices that were made for voting rights, right? That the voting rights for all Americans to be able to vote is still fairly new. It's less than 100 years old. We don't think about that. We just celebrated the centennial of the 19th Amendment. Still a little bitter about that because there was some awesome programming that women's groups across the country had lined up for August 2020, and then a pandemic hit. I'm not saying it's conspiracy against us, but listen, I was a little upset about that one. But that being said, and then you think about the Voting Rights Act of 1964, we're coming up on 60 years this year around it. These things were not won easily. People were jailed, people lost their lives, people lost homes, jobs. And so an election year is the time to remind people that this is not a time to sit out. This is a time to engage and get in the game. You may not like the options that much, but you have an obligation as someone who has the privilege of being a citizen to participate, and this is why. Those rights have been blood-born. Those rights are preserved by people who serve in the military. So there are there's a very real cost that has been paid for you to go to a ballot box. And so I feel very passionately that at minimum, those of us who have very tangible connections, you're not making a partisan statement, you're making a statement of civics and engagement. That if you have the privilege and the ability to vote, you are obligated to go in and do that because this was a hard won right. And as Coretta Scott King says, freedom isn't free. It is fought and won with every generation. So you have a generational obligation to preserve this. And it's we all have our different belief systems and where we lie on the political spectrum, especially regarding different issues. The goal here is to always make sure that people understand that your perspective matters, and it matters at the ballot box. And it's not just about the highest office in the land. The offices that most affect you are the ones that happen at the grassroots level. So we're looking at your local, your state. Sometimes you're annoyed by trash pickup in your neighborhood, and someone can ask, did you vote on this referendum? That would have changed that. Right. And so that's part of our responsibility, is to help people understand that there's a moment for engagement, not only the sacrifices made, but how the civics of this country, how this country functions, not just in Washington, D.C., where I've spent a lot of time, but also in the spaces that you live, work in, and move through every single day.
That is so eloquent, Noelle. I'm ready to go out and start some new programming right this minute. And I'm
Thank
going to
you.
definitely tailor my Frederick Douglass reading this year towards that. That sounds really inspiring. Our second panelist is Margot Shea, an associate professor of history at Salem State University, where she teaches public history, Irish history, and world history, oversees a public history certificate program, and supervises internships for history majors. She's the author of Derry City, Memory and Political Struggle in Northern Ireland, and several articles and chapters in anthologies and on heritage, memory, and collaborative practice. At the heart of her work center listening in our explorations of the past, and do not ignore the larger structures around which memory and identity take and change shape. It's wonderful to have you, Margot. I want to ask you the same question. What do you see as the role of the public historian in an election year?
Okay, thanks, Plune. And thanks, Noelle. I was really struck by that phrase, these rights are blood-born. And by everything that Noelle said, I'm a teacher. It's really kind of my major identity. And more, I encounter students who don't believe in democracy. They don't believe that there are authentic choices. They don't feel represented by our democratic institutions. And I mean, this makes me feel old, frankly. Like part of it is that. And it also is humbling. I'm humbled by my whiteness. I'm humbled by my privilege. I'm humbled by this recognition that I have often felt represented. And in, over the last few years, I have felt less represented. And Dobbs certainly affected me in that sense. But I want to just amplify Noelle's point that we have a real opportunity and a real responsibility here as public historians. And I do just want to share a couple slides, and my slides are not my research. They are Susie Wilkening's research. I'm going to put a couple URLs in the chat, and I really hope that you go to them because her work is thoughtful, it's accessible, and it is empowering for folks in the field to really think about the spaces that we inhabit as public historians, the kinds of encounters that we get to have, and the opportunities and the responsibilities that are really contingent around those spaces in an election year and an election cycle and a kind of moment in our history where the feelings are strong and the wounds are strong and the posturing is strong and the stakes are high. So I'm just going to share my screen and share just a few slides with you. So Susie, I'll drop the URLs immediately after I share just these few slides. But Susie and her team have been working on the role of historical institutions within a climate of political polarization in this country. I don't believe the polarization is anything new. I think it's just more obvious to more people. And so the stakes are high, but I don't believe, and I don't think the research suggests that these issues are anything new. But there are sort of positions that people are taking and interacting from. And so I think it's always helpful to have a vocabulary, right? Even if you don't use it at your sites, even if you just kind of keep it in-house. There are, according to this research, some different ways of thinking about how we relate to the nation. So blind patriotism, this sort of, uncomplicated belief in American nationalism, symbolic patriotism, which has there are more contingencies, there's more strings attached, and there's a relationship between believing in what the nation can be and a recognition of what the reality is. And then there are folks that have no patriotic identity, and it's really important to think about them in our programming and in our conversations. Susie's research was based on over 1,000 long kind of form questionnaires, and they've broken up kind of categories into these two, right? Neoteric is a weird word. It just means new, right? New ideas, more modern ideas. And again, the research suggests that there are different ways built around identities and experiences, including experiences with the political system at every level, from the grassroots to the national and the global, that are really shaping the way people are interacting with our historical sites and with these questions in an election year. So you can see for yourself, right? There are some patterns, there are some distinctions, and I think it's just important that we frame our messaging, not to pander to different positions, but to acknowledge the positions and to hold space for those positions. The results of the research is that, like, everybody values history, and that is an opportunity. That is a resource. But people aren't chill about engaging with it. And so when we think about shaping conversations and engaging around our shared and contested and conflicted pasts, we need to be thinking about how we do it, right? Is it interactive? Can it be kinesthetic? Can we do things, right? Instead of just being in our heads. How can we sort of breathe life into the past in ways that open up imagination and allow people to experience empathy, and to imagine sort of lived experiences that are not their own. And then also, like, how do we create environments where people find the shared balance, right? A sense of place, feeling like they control the experience, not feeling like it's heavy. Is everyone feeling like they're both included in the narratives and the narratives are honest and truthful? So this is a terrible slide. I'm really sorry. I will share it all with you in the chat, because who wants to look at all these steps? But these are some beautiful, beautiful recommendations for how those of us who are doing public history might engage around politics and questions of politics in an election year. And I just want to highlight a couple of things, right? Be curious, invite curiosity, invite people into a space that does not force them or encourage them to immediately take a stance, right? We're so about that in the public sphere right now. You got to have a position. Can you create spaces where people are curious even about their own positions, even about their own political identities and political opinions, and model civil discourse, model the fact that, you know, it is okay to have feelings, and all feelings really want are to be heard and acknowledged. But feelings don't deserve to sort of step on other people's feelings, right? And I think that we in historic organizations have modeled civil discourse and we have modeled curiosity. We do that. We are skilled at that. And I think it's just more important than ever that we carry that work into this election cycle in particular. Thanks.
Thank you. That was also really inspiring. Now we need to go up and get onto the barricades modeling. No, all kidding aside, what I'm hearing both of you say is that number one, historical organizations cannot stay with what they've always done, with what is, in the narrow sense, their mission. That the mission is broader, that it involves, that it is no longer, we are going to show all the school children of a certain age about the history of our town only, but that in fact, things have changed. I'm hearing you say, I think that the audience has changed and the times have changed in such a way that it's important to step out there and do those things that we know how to do. And so I want to ask you, how are we going to model, let's say, good behavior in public discourse, or how are we going to model not stepping on others' feelings, or even inclusivity? I don't know, Noel, do you want to take a stab at that or?
Yeah. A couple things for us to think about. Fundamentally, we always have to respect the autonomy of the visitor. You can create the best experience. When I was in Memphis at the National Civil Rights Museum, the tour concludes with visiting the room 306, where King literally spent his last moments before he was tragically killed. And I would tell the tour guides, you probably can give the best tour of your entire life to someone and they will walk out of that building stone faced. Don't take that personally, because you don't know in that moment what's going on in someone's head, right? And you don't know the impact of the information that you're going to have. And we have received emails from people days, weeks, months, years, even, decades after they visited the museum and something happens. They experience something in their life. The conversation happens. There's an event. And what they experience at the museum all of a sudden clicks and something shifts their perspective. And so I think that's the first thing, is that we can get caught up in how do I make them see it my way and understand it my way. That's not our job. Our job is to present a different perspective and allow them within the existence of their life to figure out or to let that marinate, because you don't know how that shows up, right? So our job is to model what inclusive behavior looks like. Case in point, Old North Church has a great new exhibit on their pews where they have panels and they talk about enslaved people that were part of the church community. That's a great way to show the different representations. It doesn't mean you push Paul Revere to a corner. No, he's there too, but they exist within the same space, right? That you're just highlighting multiple stories, that they show where the records are, they show the information. That's the way to do it. And then someone will opt in whether or not they do or do not choose to use it. The other way that we do it is the use of our language, right? I think we can all agree that indigenous is now the more correct way to refer to Native Americans. It's neither Native American, indigenous, or the group that they identify with. Although some people are very comfortable with American Indian, in which case, a lot of times for identity purposes, I defer to the individual. But demonstrating that deference may mean that someone says, oh, okay, maybe I should consider, using this term differently. When pronouns became a big thing, I started, when it was a big transition of putting your pronouns on your Zoom and in your emails, I found this website that explained the whole dynamic around pronoun. Now, I put it in my email signature, but I also have some portion of my email signature that says, "What's this?" And it can take someone to something else so they can understand it. Now, I can't, tell somebody what their perspective should be on pronouns, appropriate use of pronouns, he, she, they, them, these, or what have you. But at least I've offered them the opportunity to reconsider something that perhaps never occurred to them before. So I think that's fundamentally the place that we have to come in on. I mean, I think there are certain behaviors and things that we all socially view as reprehensible. Violence against others on any level. We think we're all like, yeah, we all raise our kids, don't hit, Tyler hit somebody, we say no. So there's some things that we know that there's social consequences, there's legal consequences to those actions. But outside of that sphere, presenting and demonstrating that, I cannot prescribe for someone that they have to do it this way. I can only demonstrate an opportunity to reconsider something. And perhaps after that encounter, sometime in the future, they will do that.
I'm thinking about that a lot at the moment. And the reason I'm thinking about it is because I'm deeply involved in local history on the methods level. And one of the things I found is that there are people who fall between the cracks between the towns because they move around. I mean, it used to be that we were registered in certain ways in town records and maybe, in other records as well. And we know that enslaved people tended to fall between those cracks, right? Because they moved around. They were economically so marginal, they couldn't stay in the same place. The same goes for transient farm laborers, for instance. And it's our methods of research that are allowing people to fall between the cracks. So one way of modeling good behavior or modeling inclusive questions is to say, okay, so who are we catching and who are we not catching? You know, when we talk about, I don't know, labor in Massachusetts, for instance, right? Who are we catching? Are we catching only those people who are on the rolls of large companies, right, that have been preserved because they happen to be large companies? Or are we losing the people who live in marginal economies and are much more occasional, and we find it much harder to track them? So I think
I
you're
would
so right.
So let me jump into that. I think that that's a great beginning question. But sometimes, even with that, if you're sitting around with a group of people and you're talking about an exhibition or a project and you say, who's missing? And everybody looks at each other, at some point, somebody be like, I don't know, right? I think we got everybody. I don't know. The different question is if you're examining farm labor in Massachusetts and you're looking at the different time periods of which that happens, who's bringing the product to market, right? It's spinning the perspective differently and figuring out what are the communities and who are the individuals that are making something happen. So you can celebrate Lowell as being this great sort of industrial space, and there's the weaving and there's the women. At some point, if we're trying to re-examine, I'm just using Lowell as an example, if we're trying to re-examine this, at some point, somebody's got to say, so how did they get the cotton, right? And who picked the cotton? How did the cotton get on the ships? Matter of fact, how were the ships made? Who's making the ships? Where are the ships made? Who's paying the insurance for the ships? Because y'all, we have insurance for our car. I know somebody had to have maritime insurance because you lose a few $1,000s in 18 something. That's your wealth. That's your corporate wealth. So it's asking those questions to figure out who's behind the things that we're so used to seeing. So I think it's the appropriate step is to the first step maybe to say, whose voice is not here, who are we missing? But sometimes we don't know. And perhaps us asking a different question about the event, industry, or practice that we're examining would get us to that as well.
Fabulous. Systems thinking. Think about the outcome and figuring out where it might have come from. Margot, what do you think is a good way for our organizations to demonstrate? You're muted.
I love what Noel said about the process of learning and sort of integrating new information being unpredictable and nonlinear. And I think that that's just it's such a great way to begin this conversation amongst public historians, because it's empowering, because it reminds us that we can invite people into a process and we don't know when it's going to click, if it's going to click. But we also, like not knowing kind of gives us a chance to be optimistic. We can choose, right? Are we going to be optimistic or pessimistic? And I just really wanted to amplify Noel's point that we can be optimistic. That it may take a while for someone to kind of process information that we're sharing. The other thing I really liked about what Noel said is this idea to kind of invite learning and to create opportunities that make learning and shifting and sort of, you know, shifting maybe positions that are pretty entrenched, as a model of best practice, right? And I think that that is something that this conversation about sort of historical sources and presenting and forefronting historical information that may have been previously left out is a really great way to invite learning. Something I've learned from my students is that people may not always have accurate information. And if we shame them, even totally by accident, because of the language that we use as historians, we can shut down learning. So the example that always comes up in Salem, because I teach in Salem and so many of my students work in the heritage industry in Salem, is that folks come and, and sometimes they're wearing things with really like strong political statements, and it can be a little off-putting, but they'll come along and they'll say, "Where were the witches burned?" Right? And all the Salem historians are going to roll their eyes super hard, right? The witches weren't burned in Salem, but witches were burned in European contexts, right? And so my students kind of have learned to say, you're right. There was a lot of instances in different historical contexts in different places where people were burned to death when they were accused of witchcraft. Here in Salem, they were mostly hung, and occasionally they were pressed to death. But it's kind of like, how do you encounter misinformation from your guests, and what's your gesture, right, in that moment? And I think a lot of these examples are pointing to how we model curiosity and civil discourse by kind of like not shutting it down, but thinking about where it goes from here, where it can go from here. So that's the first thing that came up for me. And I guess the other thing that kind of comes up in thinking about this is, I'm not an apologist, and I don't think that we should make everybody feel good all the time, because that it's just not fair. But I also think that it's important for us to treat people as people, right? And to really think about and have conversations with our staff and our volunteers about where like one person's sense of empowerment in kind of sharing opinions at a historic site is stepping on another person's right to exist and be visible, right? And thinking about those conversations and how to have them on our sites, it is something that I think we should be doing. I'm certainly trying to teach that, so folks don't feel blindsided. I also think it's important to really just talk about the fact that this is pretty serious labor. This is emotional, it's mental. You have to be thinking on your feet. You have to be thinking with your heart as well as your head. And now we sort of have this idea that we have to be thinking that in this moment, we may not know what the outcome is, but that doesn't sort of relinquish our responsibility to think about every encounter as a possibility to deepen and widen the frame of who gets to be a valued citizen and who gets to be a valued person in our communities, in our states, and in our nation, and obviously around the world.
Margot, I like what you said, especially in terms of the staff. I think one of the things that gets overlooked is those of us who run organizations, we have this idea of what these encounters could look like, but your front line is dealing with this on a regular basis. And so building in when you're doing this more difficult or more, I don't want to say confrontational because sometimes it's not, but it may feel confrontational for the visitors. That emotional output can come in a variety of ways. And your frontline staff, whether it's your volunteers, tour guides, security guards, whomever may bear the brunt of that. And so part of the process, while we also we respect visitor autonomy, you also have to have your folks back, right? And so if they had a particularly challenging conversation or confrontation, managed it professionally, didn't do anything that you have to like discipline them for, giving them the space to go take a walk, right? To take a breather, maybe close the door for 10 minutes. Because this sort of work can wear on you, right? I've had plenty of situations where even at a site like my site in Memphis, the site I was at in Memphis, people said some pretty inappropriate things to the frontline staff. And there were some times where they came to my office and were like, look, I told the floor manager I need to step away, but listen, I need a minute. Or they would be like, this happened. I don't know what to do. And I would say, go take a walk, get outside, breathe some fresh air, come back in a few minutes, right? Some cases I gave them, some money to go to Starbucks. Like, here's a Starbucks gift card, get a cup of coffee, breathe, it'll be okay. So we have to also do that work, right? Because as we're demonstrating inclusivity, they're challenging some things that people hold dear. Sometimes that reaction is a blowback, and the blowback is immediate, right? And it affects the people who work for us and that we care about. So not only giving them the appropriate language and training to respond in those situations, but also acknowledging that sometimes it's just hard and they need a minute to get themselves together. We're not machines, we're human beings.
I think that's a really good point that uh, as people who are managing small organizations or with public programming or in any case public facing and undertakings, that whoever it is, and especially when they're volunteers, what do you expect people to do, and how well can they be asked to do it in a climate in which is fairly confrontational? I bet you the confrontation happens the other way too with small historic organizations. That why don't you have an exhibit on Native American existence in this town? And maybe you have to say, we haven't done the research. And then the question is, well, why haven't you done the research? My response to that is, when that happens near me, is I invite you to come in and do the research, because we don't happen to have an extra volunteer who can do it, but we would like to do the research. Why don't you come and do it? We'll give you space. I don't know what others do. I'd love to hear from some of you here who are on the call, what they do when confronted with criticism, oppositional type criticism of what they're doing. I don't know. Nobody's sticking up their hand yet, but I'm not going to call on people just like that. But I bet you it happens. I have a sort of a follow-up question on that, because some of the criticisms that one gets are rooted in what we call cancel culture, or um, uh, one size fit all solutions. Uh, we like panaceas. We like if only you do this and everything will be okay solutions. And I remember, and this is not to make fun of anybody, but I remember I had a friend who said, if you said I have a headache, she would say you need to drink goji berries juice. And if you said my foot has been chopped off, she would say you need to eat some goji berries. But in fact, in our public discourse, we really love to go with the goji berries, right? Whatever the goji berries are. Um, how do we model not buying into the one step all solution or cancel culture based on one particular aspect of something? Do you have anything you wanted to say about that, Noelle? Why don't I call on you first?
Sure. I think there is an allure of the goji berries, to use your metaphor, right? Like we all want, take this, it'll be fine. They all held hands, everything was together, and we all skip into the universe, right? And that's just not the reality. And I think that one of the things we have to get comfortable with is a lack of resolution, is a lack of solution. And just to say, hear what you're saying. I don't know if there's an action around that, right? Right now, there's a lot of concern around who historical figures are, particularly, I'll just be honest, particularly white men, that, oh, they were a slave owner, so everything they did were invalidated. Well, I don't know if that's the case, but what we did before was we put them on a very high pedestal, right? And perhaps finding out that they owned slaves, made money off of enslaved people is not what we wanted to hear, but it makes them more complex. And I like the more complex, interesting character. right? So perhaps we don't pass a judgment on it, but we just say, you know what, they're human beings. I don't think anybody really and truly, with the rare exceptions, wakes up every morning deciding to be a monster, right? People wake up in the day and they make decisions about their lives. Now, some of the decisions are absolutely reprehensible. I'm not going to deny that. But we all make choices every day. These are the choices that this person made. Why did they make those choices? What did they benefit from those choices? Were the benefits personal? Were they political? Were they professional? Were they financial? Everybody does that. We all do that. And so to put a profile on someone and just say we look at it this way means that we're not really appreciating the 360 degrees with which the person exists, right? Someone can be a masterful artist and an absolutely reprehensible human being. Those two things can coexist. Our solution shouldn't be to say, well, your art is invalidated because you're a reprehensible human being. Perhaps it's to say, well, this is the art that they did. This is who they were. How do you feel about that? Right? Let's create that tension. And those are the stories that people want to see, right? A lot of the research and some of Susie Wilkening's research bears this out. People aren't really interested. There's an audience for facts and figures. There's an audience of people who are absolutely fascinated with furniture. And frankly, I'm not that interested. Like if you tell me that the furniture was made by such and such and it was imported. I'm like, great, but I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole with you for another 2 hours to talk about the furniture. If you tell me that the furniture bore witness to an affair between this person and the affair led to this and that, I'm all in. I want to know everybody who's involved. I want to know all the dirty details. And let's be honest, a whole lot of us got into this work to read the documents that nobody ever intended to make public in their lives. Like, we really just want the dirt on historical figures. And if you say, oh, no, well, that's not the case, how excited would you be if the historical person you're reading about had a diary and told you all their business, right? So we love that. That's what gets us excited. We have to share those things. And perhaps it's just letting people make a decision. And maybe some people are like, I'm having a hard time with it. Perhaps you shouldn't have a hard time with it. Like, that's the reality of humanity, right? And that's our role as public historians, public humanitarians, is to present that and to say we can be okay with this. There are some folks that I know did some great work in the civil rights movement, but as parents and partners were horrible people, right? I would not let them within a shooting distance of my own sisters, right? But I got to acknowledge what they did for the movement, right? These things can coexist, and that's what we have to wrestle with.
I really like that. That our modeling should consist of complicating the narrative. And it's interesting because I'm engaged in the process of creating a bunch of historical signs. And one of them is for a mill site. And I was advocating that we write a little thing about the problem of having dams, the ecological problem of having dams, so that every mill site where you preserve the dam, it's a decision you have to think about. And that did not make it on the sign because that was undermining the idea that this mill needed to exist. And yet I feel like the purpose of having that dam there is to think about whether you should take it down or not in many ways, right? Or what other dams, like maybe you choose to leave this dam. And in the same way about people, complicating the narrative brings people in, doesn't it? It's like a soap opera, right? Will he or will she, right?
It's the living embodiment of reality TV. I don't think people are watching soap operas, but people will watch a whole lot of Bravo, right? And so you want the drama, you want the decisions. And the other thing is that a decision made in 18 something, 19th century, may not be the best decision for us today, right? So a mill dam that was put there in the 19th century probably made a whole lot of sense. They didn't have the climate change issues that we have. So today, what should happen? And so rather than just saying, well, let's put it at the table at the end of a sign, is that an audience interactive? Some of the best exhibitions I've been to are the ones that give people a choice. And sometimes it's as simple as take a red token, put it in and put it in the jar if you believe this, this, or this, or you put a pin on something. And you take a photo every day and you see where your audience is, or it evolves over time. You know, things don't have to last in the same way forever. Very, very few things do. And so presenting our audience with those options lets them reconsider not only what happened in the past, but who we can be now and in the future.
Margot.
Yeah, two things came up for me. Some of you guys know that I've spent 25 years sort of living in and out of Northern Ireland and thinking a lot about the conflict and the peace process. And one of the things that really strikes me is that the conflict in Northern Ireland was so intractable because people's whole identities, like everything, their faith, their schools, their neighborhoods, their social outlets, the sports they played, the TV they watched, it all sort of over time became totally inextricable from their political identities, right? And so watching the process of peace building in Northern Ireland has been watching a process of kind of how do you start to pull out some of those strands and acknowledge them, hold space for them, and also sort of find those places of shared experience and shared identity without negating or just kind of sweeping under the rug the very real historical conflicts and divides. And that just made me think about, Noelle was in Memphis. I was in South Central Tennessee for a couple of years. And one of the things that I worked on with my students was interpreting the Highlander Folk School's original site. And the Highlander Folk School, some of you guys know, it started as a union sort of school. It started as a folk school. It became a place for union organizing. In the South during Jim Crow segregation, there were no places for Black and white workers to legally kind of come together. And so Highlander became a civil rights site, and it's really understood by a lot of historians as a sacred site, right? But the mountain where the Highlander Folk School was originally was almost entirely white, had a long history with convict leasing and some really kind of severe racism. And the Highlander Folk School was, there were arson attempts, and ultimately it was shut down and it moved to Knoxville. And so we opened up the site for free tours, and all different kinds of people came, right? People came because they thought Highlander was a really important place. People came because they were just nosy, right? Or curious is a nicer way to say it, but they had heard really salacious rumors about what happened at Highlander. Some people came because their parents had worked there in the kitchens or on the grounds. So it brought a real cross section of folks from around the kind of Chattanooga region up on the mountain. And on a tour, somebody mentioned that like they remembered their parents talking about this folk school throwing square dances, right? Hoedowns. And that was something that a lot of people came to, whether they agreed with the politics or not. It was great music. It was always a potluck. And we ended up throwing one at Highlander. And I really kind of think of it again as this embodied sort of social experience that people get to have together. I don't know if anybody's minds got changed about the historical past. I don't know, if people sort of left their experiences thinking really differently about history. But I do know that they did sort of they were invited, and most of them accepted the invitation to relate to folks who were very different from them and who held very different political opinions for just one night to just kind of connect around food and music and dance. And that sounds like so it's not big, right? It sounds kind of small, but when you think about that example I told about Northern Ireland, where people just their enmities and their polarization was fed by distance, I do wonder what we can do as public historians to create opportunities for fellowship, right? And whether or not, a lot of the research suggests that it's one-on-one relationships, and it's one-on-one relationships with folks that are different from us, that can sometimes shift, especially folks who have a lot of privilege, and folks who feel like their identity is sort of just totally tied to whatever their political opinion is. Those kinds of things can make a difference. So I don't know. Like, I don't, it sounds really Pollyanna-ish when I say it, but I still somehow believe in relationships as part of this work that we're doing.
Margot, I don't think it's Pollyannish at all. I actually think that, and the research has borne this out, that there are some universal themes that we can use to bring people together. And sometimes you don't have to hit people over the head with an idea. It's just cracking something just a little bit, right? So family is important. We love our family. We have complex relationships with our family. We all have that weird one relative that we wish would just not show up to family events, but they keep showing up. We all have that, right? And so that's a point of relationship. And so if you're telling family stories at your site, there's something there for folks. There's something there around food and about music and around dance. And it may not be the exact music or the exact dance that you like, but there's something about the activity of coming together that people respond to. And so being exposed to that, sharing, there have been so many great studies about foodways and those sorts of exchanges where people realize, well, I've never had Indian food before. But if you get introduced to, you may not like everything, but you may get introduced to something you never considered before. And you may say, oh, well, this was too spicy for me, but I really like the flavor overall. I think I want to try that differently, right? Personally, I really like meat stuffed pastries. There has yet to be a culture that has a meat stuffed pastry that I am not down for the cause. Pierogi, empanadas, the little Cornish paste, whatever it is, if it's seasoned meat in between some dough, I am down to figure it out and eat. But that's something that it took me a while to be exposed to different cultures to realize everybody has this, and I love to try what someone else has. And so providing those opportunities and as small historic sites, that's what we can do, right? We can go deeper into those sort of foodways and exchanges. And because we're in neighborhoods and neighborhoods have identities that evolve over time, you can present, the immigrant story, which is on top of an indigenous story, which is on top of people of African descent story, which is on top of, a Latino story. Like there's these multiplicity of things that can happen, and all these things happen in the same place. And so if you can expand your mission or at least your mind a little bit to say, we're not going to beat you over the head with historical past, but maybe we just want you to come in and experience the joy of this space, of this moment, of this event. And then we'll see what else happens.
Yeah, Margot just wrote, I'd love an event centered around pocket food from different cultures as a way to explore a community's history. I'm reminded that when I was at Mass Humanities years ago, we funded a series that the Sharon Historical Society, I think, was putting on along with some other organizations in Sharon. And they were basically exploring all those layers and all those people who had come to Sharon and were now in Sharon, sharing food, all different kinds. And because everybody sort of had their turn, every community had their turn in the series, and everybody was invited to it all. That really got people together. It was a really fruitful way of getting people together. I wanted to highlight something that Susan Navarre just said, but I think she says she doesn't have a mic. Is that still the case, Susan? Right. Okay, so her mic broke. One method I have seen for sharing the both and in history is in the Netherlands, where they have added new labels in orange, which is, as I can tell you as a person from the Netherlands, that is the national color, next to the older labels. And the new labels tell the history previously left out, wealth from enslaved people, etc. It gives people the chance to only read the new history if they want, or to see the dialogue. What seems to me, I haven't seen it yet. I haven't been there for a while, but one of the things that's funny is because of course that orange color is the royal family, and they are the wealthiest people in the Netherlands, and their oil is that of colonialism, and so it's kind of an interesting that they chose orange for that label. Not a bad idea. 2 different labels on things, or maybe even 3 or 4 different labels on something. Sounds like a good idea. I wanted to pick up on something that Noelle said quite some time ago in her early comments, which was about taking on the responsibility of getting people to engage in some of the things that are most important in what's going on in our country today. And one of those is, for instance, getting people to vote and taking part, becoming aware of the civics, becoming aware of their, one might call their civic duty. I don't know. And then I wanted to combine that with the idea of not staying neutral, and the thought that a lot of things that we previously thought were neutral, were, just history, are now seen as political by some and not by others, which makes it kind of difficult, because someone may say, oh, here you got that person with their liberal politics because they're telling people to vote. What are we going to do with that? And what happens when people don't agree with what you're doing? And, in very public ways. Has anybody had come across that? The idea that what you're doing, because it engages history, is political. That I don't hear anybody from the audience. Margot, you want to take a stab at that one?
I'm so sorry. I was answering a question in the chat. Will you just quickly summarize it?
I'm sorry. I was so
I'm the worst. I'm like the worst teacher ever. I'm like, oh yeah, and I wasn't listening.
no, she's like, she's got it. So I will, I can float away for a moment. I was basically picking up on something that Noelle said, and maybe I should ask Noelle to comment, because she said in the beginning, essentially she said, one of our big roles in the public consciousness is to remind people or teach them about the historic portent of some of their rights in a democracy. And I then coupled that with the question of people not liking what you're doing because that's seen as left-leaning or right-leaning, and couple that maybe with you talking about young people who are feeling jaundiced about democracy. People can get pretty aggressive about if they don't like it what you're doing. How do we even in a one-to-one dialogue, how do you go push through someone who says you're just being political because of the right wing, whatever, left wing, fill in the blank portion?
Yeah. I mean, I can say I teach a lot of students who are not history majors, and they have to take a history course to fulfill their requirements. And so we have these kinds of conversations a lot around like big P versus small p politics. And I think, and I know that some students probably, like, I'm very careful to say, this is my opinion. I do not expect you to share my opinion. And I think that's important, right? Sort of moving away from, like, we live in this culture of these kind of universalized discourses on different sides of the political spectrum, and inviting us back into our personhood, and sort of acknowledging and even like illustrating that that in itself is political, right? Our right to free speech, our right to hold political opinions, is something that is protected by a constitution that every single one of us needs to value and hold up. Right. And I think that to me is the thing. Like, it sounds like, a lot of the examples Noelle gave, and certainly my experience, um, is that like politics is work, it's process, politics is relationships. It's not, and I feel like people think it's TikTok, or people think it's, you know, Truth Social, or they think it's Fox News versus NPR. And I think this kind of like this making more transparent the work of politics, and also like reminding people of what it means to be intentionally excluded from the political process and the political conversation, is something we cannot ignore. It is something that is part of our history, and it is something that is potentially part of our future. It's certainly part of our political present. I teach a lot of immigrants, right? They are completely unrepresented if they are not documented. They can't even apply for a FAFSA. So for me, it's the work of politics is process, politics is work, and combining that with my right to believe certain things about politics, and my right to care about certain things about politics is something that's actually protected and is really fragile. And that, I think like at least the kids get it, right? The kids kind of get it. Like when you don't have any right, when you don't have any voice, um, all of a sudden they think like, oh, okay, maybe the system is not as broken, right? Because there is room, there is possibility. So I don't know if that gets at the question. I'd love to hear what other people think.
I'll add from a practical sense, so there were decisions that were made prior to many of us coming into these roles around America's education system, around civics, right? And so we know that museums are trusted authorities, but this idea of civic engagement, which used to be part of like what your first or second grade class, and many classrooms across the country no longer exist, right? And so part of the responsibility that has fallen on our shoulders as institutions, and it kind of depends on what your institution is responsible for and what part does it make sense, is, part of it is just making people aware of civic engagement, what their civic rights is. That's not political. Helping you understand the Bill of Rights is not a partisan political move. That is just saying this is foundational for this country. It gets complicated because things have shifted. When I started in this work many years ago, there was more of like a church and state sort of separation between a lot of the work that we're doing, and we're seeing that get more and more muddled. And so, for people who are tied to a city, to some sort of governmental thing, there's a lot more nuanced movement, nuanced choreography that has to happen, even if this is the same thing that you've been talking about for the past 25, 30 years, right? The dynamics have changed. At one point, as an institution, you do have to say, are we going to do it anyway, right? I forget who says it, but there's a quote out there that says, if someone says you're this, but it matters to one person, do it anyway, right? Like, this has social significance. Do it anyway. Let's talk about these things anyway, understanding the risk. We should not do some of these basic sorts of inclusive, awareness building, civic education, around some of these core ideas because we're afraid of what people's reactions will be. People will always have a reaction. I will acknowledge that reactions are changing and they're more dangerous than they've ever been. Case in point, in 2017 in Memphis, they took down the Confederate statues. And that was a big to-do. And there was a response from the community around that. And on social media, somebody put, well, if they take down one of our monuments, let's take down one of theirs. One of theirs ended up putting a target on the National Civil Rights Museum. And so they had a rally that January, right before Dr. King's birthday holiday. And we're going to had every intention of driving up to our campus, and Lord knows what they intended. We had to switch gears in a way that we've never had to switch gears before, in a way that I never had to consciously think about some things before, right? Operations and the other leadership were involved in conversations with Homeland Security. Law enforcement was involved. We had senior team had to come into work on that Saturday just to be there, just in case, right? None of us got into this work worried about these sorts of threats, right? That there's a potentiality for these threats. Those threats are real. I'm not saying that you don't host these conversations. I'm not saying that you don't do this work, but we also can't afford to be naive because the dynamics of this world have changed so much. And even here in Massachusetts, there were groups who did some events around the Tea Party anniversary, and were a little unprepared for people arriving at the event carrying a gun. Now, I'm all about the Sixth Amendment or Second Amendment rights, and understanding people's rights. But what are you going to do when that happens, right? You have to have a plan. You have to be aware. And are you going to not tell the story? Are you not going to do this work because of that? I'm not saying you don't. I am saying that we have to be astute in our work. And now more than ever, especially as smaller organizations, we're never fully aware of how people perceive us community-wise. You don't want to be alarmist, but have some level of future casting where you're saying, if this happens, we have this person, this person, this person. And sometimes it might just be the volunteer who's an off-duty police officer, right? And you call them up and say, hey, we're having this event. Can you come hang out and Plain Crows, right? They may do it because they care about the organization, but you have that support there just in case. You know, I hate saying that to this group. I wish that wasn't the reality, but the dynamics of this world have changed. And so when we're putting out these stories, we're doing this work and we're challenging people, we have to be aware now that response to those challenges may no longer be a simple discussion or argument. They can have very real consequences for the safety of our site, of our staff, and of ourselves.
It's a whole new wrinkle on disaster planning, doesn't it? We have a hand up from Rosemary Trowbridge. Go ahead, Rosemary.
Hi. Hi. I'm with the Lexington Lyceum, and Carolyn Goldstein told me about this event. And one of the things that I think about is civic education and how people get discouraged from voting because the things that most people care about are never seem to get into law, like healthcare for everyone, climate, gun control, etc. And one book that I just learned a lot from is The Tyranny of the Minority by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt at Harvard. And what they pointed out, one, as European countries since the late 1700s, 1800s have modernized their constitution. So they have direct democracy. Supreme Court either has age limit terms or limited terms. They don't have a House of Lords anymore. England does, where they weakened it. So there's much more direct democracy. But we have so many things like, for instance, we've elected presidents that didn't get a majority of the votes of the popular vote. So you have a person who doesn't represent the majority, then can put people on the Supreme Court for life through the Senate. The Senate is elected and every 2 years, there's a third elected. It takes 18 years to go through the whole Senate to change it. They've got 6 years each. They're elected by someone who doesn't represent majority to begin with, and they put people on the Supreme Court for a lifetime. The Senate doesn't have to do anything unless there's 60 votes. for filibuster. And now you don't even have to talk 8 million hours. You just have to file a motion that you will filibuster and nothing gets voted on. So you can be a president like Biden, who was elected by the majority, but because of the filibuster, because of nasty stuff in the past with the Supreme Courts, your hands are tied. And people say, well, why vote? And I think we need a better job explaining how our government works, why it's written the way it was from the beginning, compromises around slavery, so people understand why it's not that the rest of the people in the United States don't have similar majority opinions, but it's not structured to represent us. That's a bigger question, how to change that, which is huge. But if people understood that, they wouldn't be so discouraged. Maybe they'd be most encouraged to work on it.
Well,
So I think the big picture helps.
yeah, Rosemary, thank you so much for that. And I put the link to the book you mentioned in the chat. I think,
It's a short book too.
yeah, and I think the challenge there is we cannot tackle all of it alone, right? So each of our organizations, you tackle the bit that you think works best for you. And I'll tackle the bit that I think we make sense for my institution. And hopefully that makes some impact. I am the result of a community that did it anyway. My ability to sit in this seat, to have a PhD, to have attended public and private schools was the result of a group of people who, despite being very discouraged and not seeing themselves represented, continued to press. And so part of that work that we have to do is to show the who did it anyway, right? Keeping to wait for something to be convenient, to be packaged in the right way for us is only going to be breed frustration. And the challenge that we have today is that everybody's used to information coming in sound bites. Sound bites 140 words. And I remember when George Will and Donald Trump during the first election, it was 2012, whatever, got into it. At one point, Will said, listen, part of my idea is have to write in more than 140 characters. It was a great slam by a very articulate journalist who I don't always politically agree with, but it was a very astute observation. And so part of it is to figure out how do we pull people from that 140 characters, 50 seconds, 15 seconds of video on their phone device into a conversation that leads them to a broader consideration and broader dialogue.
Good luck with that. I do think that I totally hear what you're saying. I think one of the things that Rosemary brings up is that people have concerns. People who say, I'm not being heard, we can tap into those concerns and we can, as always, complicate and go to detail and say, you are correct. You are living in a country where the minority gets to rule because of these reasons and this historical process. And there is but one way forward for you to change it, because the world is no longer such where you can go and carry a musket and kick some British out of your town. That there's only one way forward because you do have a vote, and so it seems to me that one can again pick up on the concerns, and maybe it's our duty to say to not allow words like equality and democracy and things like that to stand uncomplicated, right? That we say we live in a democracy. Do we really? Is it the duty of the historical organization to say a lot of people saying we're not? Are we not? Let's look at that, right? I think everybody in almost so many people in Massachusetts live with a form of direct democracy that is antiquated and in fact has its own problems, right? In the town meeting, that's a direct connection for, I don't know how many, I have no idea what the numbers are on how many towns still have a town meeting, that direct town meeting that runs a town. But I bet you it's at least half. And And so that already is a narrative that for at least half the towns has direct connection to what they're doing. So there's always a lot there. And, I think that's, Noel, is what you're saying, right? You can't take it all on, but you can take on what pertains to you, right? I think this is a fascinating conversation. I would like to invite anybody else who feels that they want to make a contribution. Have you done a program? Have you done anything that has really been able to, do you have problems with your town in entering into political dialogue? What is the current political chill doing to you? I'm not yet seeing a response on that. I wanted to bring up Ken Burns. I know that most of us may not have seen Ken Burns, but I came to remember what it was. Ken Burns has held a fantastic uh, commencement address, gave a fantastic commencement address at Brandeis. And one of the things he says is, we always say history repeats itself, but it doesn't. He says what is always there is the character of the human being, and that doesn't change all that fast over time. And so we need to step back and go, and we keep having to contend with that. We keep having to contend with greed. We keep having to contend with people beating each other up or wanting all the power. And he didn't say it like that, but that was essentially, I think, what he meant. And there are things in there to go to, right, that we can talk with each other about. Dawn, go for it.
Well, I don't know if it's related, but our board is working on, and we're not the first to do this. We may be kind of behind many others, but we're doing like kind of what Harvard just issued about when do we speak and when do we not speak. That's kind of my relation to this whole topic right now is when will we make some kind of public statement on current events, whether we side with somebody in a war or that kind of thing. So the board is about to tackle that decision. And I know so I'm from a historic house museum, and I know other places already have kind of, it's like a rubric for, or an evaluation matrix for when do we speak out on things. And typically I think most organizations are leaning into their missions and like, well, it's our job, public history is our job. So we speak on these things and not on these other things. But I've also heard in conference sessions, NEMA, some people are, I think, in organizations are of the mind, like, we always have to speak out because, we're not neutral and there are opinions and we speak on every issue. So that was my kind of relation to the topic.
So that's going to be my last question to Noel and Margot, is do we need to speak out on every issue, in your opinion, that goes around in 140 words or characters? Or
Absolutely not. I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish, please.
go ahead, Noel.
I was going to say absolutely not. I think, Don, more organizations need to do what your organization is doing, is identifying when and where is appropriate for you to speak. Let's be real. We're a bunch of small organizations on this call. Funding is tight, right? A whole lot of us are looking at, how are we funding, who are supporters? And so, as much as I've got ideas around what I like, my personal opinion when it comes to the organization really isn't that relevant. I have to look at what my organizational mission is, what our tactics are, and what's in the best advantage for us. We're not neutrals, so we'll never talk about, we won't be completely silent, but there are some things that are not appropriate for my institution to comment on. But there are some things it makes absolute complete sense for us to comment on. And I think more of us have to do that deep dive as to what makes sense for us. This is a nuanced thing for history organizations, especially those of us who are smaller with very lean budgets that are very much dependent on contributed revenue versus earned revenue. We cannot afford to make a comment on everything, right? And so really taking that stance and negotiating that, I don't think every opinion needs to be motivated by the financial, gains, but we can't pretend that some of that doesn't come into the decision making around it, right? And sometimes you do it anyway. But I do think that more of us need to sit down and figure out what is our boundaries, what is the space that we're going to occupy with these public opinions.
Yeah, I just want to second that. I was talking this morning with the chair of my department about a working group that I was asked to join about a very sort of divisive campus issue. And I said, my strategy is to mostly be quiet and to cultivate a presence where when I speak, people listen to me. And I really think that's kind of what we should be thinking about, within our organizations and our institutions. We can't, have something to say at Jump for everything, but we want to leverage the fact that a lot of people from very different backgrounds do trust our organizations. And so we want to kind of honor that trust, and we want to be able to leverage that trust when it's really relevant and it's really important.
I couldn't agree with you more. Tim?
Hi, friends. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm not sure if any of you have had the chance to see the temporary exhibit that Revolutionary Spaces in Boston has in the Old State House, but I'm thinking about it now as I listen to how one tackles difficult, politically charged history in a way that inspires and provokes thought, even one on what some people consider sacred ground. And it's around political violence. And they used the 250th anniversary of the destruction of the tea to spark a conversation. And what's interesting about it to me is, one, the way they're presenting is not stale. The background information, the background painting is all in the style of graphic novels. So you're looking at artifacts and you're having the context, but you're visualizing it in a new medium. And then they lead you through decision points. Do you think it was appropriate to do extra legal political violence in this case? They asked that question 3 different times. And at the end of it, they bring 3 other examples from American history into the conversation. One, a railroad strike in the 19th century. One, the Weather Underground in the 1960s. And one, January 6th. And that's part of it. And you cannot walk through that and get to that end and feel like that's jarring and dissonant. You end up feeling like, oh my goodness, now I'm going to have a response. Because it isn't, I think, our job to make people comfortable. It is our job not to traumatize while we're getting people engaged with complicated history. And I found that pretty bold and inspiring, and just thought I'd mention it.
What a great thing to say. It is not our job to make people comfortable. It is our job not to traumatize them while we engage them with complicated history. I think that that alone should go on a flag, I think. That's a responsible way, isn't it, of taking on, because especially the Tea Party has taken on so much resonance in different backgrounds. I want to thank you all. I want to especially thank Noelle and Margot, and I want to thank the participants. I want to thank Jane Siaka and our sponsors for having this conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing as many of you as we can in the fall, when we will be taking on the issue of lost labor, let's say, people who are falling between the cracks, and we are going to look at maybe researching Latino history. If you, any of the topics I've mentioned, we'll be putting on a call pretty soon. If you know who would be a good person to be a panelist, always let us know. And meanwhile, please give us an evaluation. And I hope you, and then the deadline just passed for registering for the Mass History Conference on Monday. But if you should suddenly feel that you really do want to go, I'm sure you can walk in on Monday with your check. So thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone. And we will see you in the fall.
Thanks, Plune. Thanks, Noelle.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone, for
Thank
coming.
you, everyone. Thank you, Margot. Thank you, Plune.
I'm trying to.
All right.
All right. Just wanted to say thank you
Thank you.
and all the best to you and Matthew.
Thanks. You think it was okay?
I
Oh,
thought
it was wonderful. You were
thought it
both
was
wonderful.
Yeah, you were both really good, and you were not the
It was
same, and yet you were not opposites. So that's really good, right? That's what you want.
very
Complicated
inspiring.
history. I love that what that guy said. Our
Yes,
job is not.
to make
What did
people
he say?
comfortable, to
Our
make people
job is not to
comfortable.
make people comfortable, but our job is not to traumatize them while we engage them with
Yeah.
We should, yes, adopt
That should
that.
be a tagline. Yeah, I like it. I really like it. Yeah, well, thank you both. Thanks, Plune. Your moderation was, as always, really excellent. Yeah, I mean, it's like it's hard when the people don't have their cameras on, but I think it was good, and
I just be so nice if it was like it used to. Remember in the beginning, people would just be like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah."
I know it was. I think people were dying to connect, though. It was the pandemic. I have a little bit of it was like the beginning of the pandemic, we were all just like, please, I need to
Talk
connect.
to me. Talk to me.
People were
So do
lonely.
you think we should get more panelists?
No.
I think it would make more sense to make sense, or should we seed the audience with, you know, with people who have something to say?
Oh, maybe. Maybe. I also wonder if you can do like, and this is something I could even do over the summer if we could figure it out. But I think it'd be really nice to take a look at who's come a lot, right? Like look at people who just regularly come, whether they have their cameras on or not, whether they are known to us, personally or not, and like reach out to those people and be like, would you like to moderate? Would you like to be a panelist? Like sort of, because I think there is a pretty good core group of folks who come.
Right.
And if we could engage them, it would be like engaging the sort of, I don't know, it's like it's not a fair thing to say like they're the second string, but just like to bring in new voices simply because they value the conversations. So that might be a way, right? Like if people
I really like that idea.
so
I really like that idea.
I think it's also interesting how many people listen when it's posted.
or on YouTube, like or
Yeah.
when it's live streamed.
Yeah,
I think
because I don't
yeah.
know that we have the whole picture of who sees it or who doesn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, they get some regular traffic, right? Although we don't feature them enough, in
Yeah.
outreach,
Do that. I mean, the communication committee can work on that.
Yeah, it'd be nice to like, let's say, times we have featured African American history, or at times we have featured difficult issues to tackle for historical organizations, or at times we have featured something really practical, like, I don't know what, gift
Oh, I
shop,
like that idea. I like that we can make little like
bundles.
like little bundles. I think that's a great idea. And I also think like if we can if something's big is happening in a community and someone from their historical organization spoke, even if it was on a different issue, but if it's a big centennial, like Lexington and Concord, and people from Lexington or Concord were speakers on one of the conversations, to just highlight that, right? Like figuring out different streams to bring people back into the conversations would be great. Yeah. I'm happy to do a little bit of that this summer if we can think about how how to do it. I
Yeah,
don't think I have
slicing and
access to
dicing.
the, I don't think I have access to the registrations at this point, but I might
No,
still.
but we can get those to you pretty readily, and we have two people working on those kinds of things now, right? So, not only Rachel, but Lindsay is working on it
Lindsay
too.
is too. So Lindsay, yeah, that was
So,
great. Yeah, I feel like, sometimes people are just having lunch and they don't want to have their camera on.
and I hear
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
I sit
I
in on.
shut mine off to eat lunch, I must say.
I
Yeah.
know. It's
So I think
I-
I think 20
modern-
people, I think there being 20 people on a Friday afternoon in June is amazing.
I thought so. 22 we got out of
Yeah,
the
very nice.
7 registered, which is pretty high
Mhm.
And I'll
percentage.
be in the Netherlands in a little over a week, and I'm going to look for orange signs. So
Yeah, which museum is that? Is that the Verzets Museum or something like that? Which museum? Just general
Didn't
museum?
say.
no,
I think
we're just flying in Amsterdam. I'm going to leave on a Viking cruise from Amsterdam and
Yeah.
through the Netherlands, and so I'm going to read signs.
Yeah.
I'm
have a
here.
great time.
Have a
Thank you.
wonderful time. I hope you have good weather.
I
And
do
hope the
too.
Rhine is not too dry. All right,
Okay.
see you later. Margot,
Okay.
let's go paddling one of these days.
Yes, let's. Okay. Bye. Thanks
Thank you.
again.